One of the primary people was Ibn Sina, who was a Persian polymath. To a modern physicist like me, Ibn Sina is extremely annoying because he wasn't even a physicist, primarily. He was a doctor. He was a medical doctor. He wrote a lot about the human body and anatomy. He did physics in his spare time, and he invented conservation of momentum. This is very annoying to me. He was a Persian polymath in the Islamic Golden Age, around the year 1000. And as a modern-day theoretical physicist, I find Ibn Sina extremely annoying because his day job was he was a doctor. His interests were in health and human anatomy, and he wrote many books about the human body. And on weekends, he invented new fundamental laws of physics. We can't do that anymore.
The preservation of ancient knowledge is something that only a few of us get to do in history. And to pass it on to the people who would later use it is something that almost no one ever does. Ibn Sina is one of these exceptional men who not only contributes in medicine, but also contributes in several other fields. And when I say contribute, I mean using a large amount of contribution, changing the science forever. In medicine, he wrote the Canon of Medicine, and he did not invent every cure in there. In fact, a lot of the time, all he did was take the best medical knowledge, scientific knowledge, and so on, and put it inside the Canon of Medicine. This book, called the Canon of Medicine, clearly does not only talk about medicines, but talks about the planet, animals, people, and all kinds of things that we still use today. Now, here's the thing about the Canon of Medicine. See, it's almost like a encyclopedia in that it's a summary of the knowledges that are there. But because it was so well written, some people didn't even bother to go check the original sources. It's almost like Wikipedia in that sense. Wikipedia is useless if you're just going to believe what they say, but there's nothing wrong with it if you go and check the sources that they provide, and if they don't match up to your standard of understanding and truth, then you can reject it. Some people want to reject it fully for no reason, but that's not an important thing. Now, looking at this Canon of Medicine, there are stuff in here that are beyond their time, above and beyond their time. And then there are stuff that's in here that really comes from ancient or prehistoric Africa. For example, the humors. For some reason, as deep the thinkers of Islam, as hardcore as they were in physics, maths, religion, war, peace, law, everything, for some reason they just couldn't escape the humors. They couldn't escape the idea that you had to get rid of bad blood, get rid of bad bile, get rid of all kinds of things inside your body, even though they were very, very experimental. Now, we could blame them for this, but remember, even the Europeans didn't get rid of this till very, very late in history. In fact, this thing is still practiced in some parts of the world today. Now, in Africa, the people who still practice it are mainly people who believe in traditional medicine. A lot of that has been thrown away, but there are some people who practice it. Now, why is Avicenna so important if what he was doing for the most part was collecting information from other people around the, well, globe, really? Well, two reasons. One, he contributed by himself, but what happened is some original notes have been lost. But because of his great record keeping and great tightness of writing, we can actually figure out what the original, or we don't, it doesn't even matter what the original said, because we have enough information right here tight for us. Now, of course, we all know that in the Quran, being clean is something that's very important, and washing your entire body properly with clean water is something that is recommended highly. If we read, it says in the Quran 2:2 says, "For God loves those who turn to Him constantly, and He loves those who keep themselves pure and clean." And then the Quran 5:6 says, "O believers, when you rise up for prayer, wash your faces and your hands up to the elbows, wipe your heads and wash your feet up to the ankles. And if you are in a state of full impurity, then take a full bath. But if you are ill on a journey, or have relieved yourself, or have been intimate with your wives and cannot find water, then purify yourself with clean earth by wiping your face and hands. It is not Allah's will to burden you, but to purify you and complete His favor upon you. So perhaps you will be grateful." And that's obviously great advice, especially if you're a doctor of some kind. This tells us the type of people that we're dealing with. And so when it comes to surgery and stuff like that, there is no reason to worry about a lot of contamination and stuff like that. Now, bad things did happen, obviously, in surgery, but they tried to minimize this by understanding cleanliness. Here's a part on the canon of medicine which talks about the children from birth to, growing up. And it says, "When the child begins to creep about, it must not be allowed to make strenuous efforts or be encouraged to walk or sit erect before the natural desire to do so appears. Otherwise, there may be injury done to its legs and back. When it first sits up or creeps over the ground, it is best to place it upon a smooth skin to prevent injury by roughness in the floor. Bits of stick or any object able to pierce or cut the skin must be kept out of its way. Care must be taken that it does not fall off some elevated place. When the canine teeth are about to appear, the infant must be allowed to chew at anything hard, lest the material from which these teeth need to be made should become dissolved by the process of mastication. The gums should be rubbed with hare's brain and cock's fat, as this will help their eruption. After the appearance of the teeth, the infant's head and neck should be rubbed with oil, which has been shaken up with hot water, and a little of the same oil may still be instilled into the ears. As soon as the infant is able to bite with its teeth, it will show this by trying to bite its own fingers. It should then be given a stick of not too dry licorice root or inspissated Spanish juice to chew at, for this will be beneficial at this period and will prevent ulcers from forming in the gums and dull the pain and irritation of teething. The gums may also be rubbed with salt and honey to relieve the pain. When the teeth are fully out, the infant may be given a stick of licorice or root of licorice to bite at. When the canines are fully out, it is good also to rub the neck with some form of sweet oil, later still when the infant begins to talk. This is a great place to begin because obviously the health of a human being starts when they are born. And if you don't take care of your kid when they're young, it really doesn't matter how well you take care of them when they grow up. And that's not just physically, it's also mentally and stuff like that. And clearly, this is only a piece of this. Clearly, at that time, they had some of the best people writing some of the best books at the time, even though, people don't know this part. It's quite impossible to have kids without having intercourse, and there is many ways in which this book talks about it. And then it also talks about the health of the mother who gives birth to the kid, and how and what she should eat in order to prevent complications later, not only to the child but to itself. Now, this is interesting because Ibn Sina is a doctor in the truest sense, and it almost seems like he had no biased political stances when it came to stuff of medicine. Because although he talks about all kinds of things, he doesn't necessarily put a moral spin on anything, with a few exceptions, of course, when it comes to demons and stuff like that. But in general, he talks about good things. Well, he talks about things neutrally. To prove this, remember, drinking alcohol is forbidden in Islam. But it says this: if the milk has an unpleasant odor, the remedy is to give as a drink a fragrant wine, and as food, foods of pleasant odor. Rules regarding the period of time which has elapsed since the wet nurse was herself confined. The birth should have been recent, namely 1.5 months at least, 2 months if the child was a male. The birth should have occurred at the proper date and not premature, nor should there be a history of habitual premature births. Now, speaking of births, we go to a different section talking about abortions. When discussing the subject, we see a surprise in that he doesn't pass judgment on it, as he says, menstruation is defective owing to constrictions of the channels and absence of the stimulus to menstrual flow and to relaxation of the channels. Some assert that this makes the woman sterile, that their womb do not open, but this is contrary to experience. At any rate, as regards the Germans, Turks, Parthians in other readings, my opinion is that the great amount of innate heat makes up for the absence of the stimulus to flow and to dilate the channels. Abortion, it is said, is rare amongst women in these climates, and this fact further supports the opinion that their virility is great. However, parturition is not easy because the organs in question remain hard and will not open easily. If abortion should occur, it must be ascribed to the cold. The milk will be scanty and thick because the cold prevents the blood from flowing easily enough to the breast. The point is not to cover the entire book, but as you can see, he clearly goes step by step in the growing of the human, which is actually new at the time. There is a book in ancient Egypt that goes step by step into the medicines in history, but that was a one of a kind too back in its day. So this book here again was used up until the 1900s. It was written in 900 AD, but it lasted for 1,000 years. At about the same time, the Kitab al-Tasrif that talks specifically about surgery came out, and you can see there all the depictions and instruments that were used for surgery at the time. Now, I cannot confirm if there was ever such a thing as elective surgery, except for, of course, bottom surgery. That was very typical in that day because there were eunuchs who would be considered higher in the ladder than most other people. So some people would come as voluntary eunuchs, but others would come in as slaves who opted to become eunuchs so they could rise in rank. This especially happened under the Turks. The person who wrote this book was Abu al-Qasim Khalaf ibn al-Abbas al-Zaharwari, al Ansari. The last part is al Zahrawi al Ansari. To aid in health, to be well, and to live well. That is the message of the Muslim. And not only that, but to make sure that you have a good spot for yourself after you die. But this was not the mentality of these doctors. These doctors surely thought in more rational ways, and in fact, you can find them writing things that would seem irreligious or even atheist at times. The writings of this specific writer, who's from Abbas, so I'll just call him Al Abbas, the writings of this writer not only show that these doctors were concerned, I mean, you'll see the difference between doctors today. They weren't just concerned with the medicine part, but with the building of the tools and making sure that they are of the right build before they hit the factory. This also tells you how big the scale must have been back in the day in terms of, like, think about how many places must have just been there just to build half these things. You build the hospitals, you get the people, the patients from the hospital to, or from their home to the hospital, and then you start doing surgery on them. Now that might seem like a whatever, like duh, what else would you do because we live today? But remember what was going on in other parts of the world. There are parts in the world which had medicine and had thrown it away for religion. And there are parts in the world where there had never been anything of this type. So we're talking about a futurized civilization that had gone beyond anything that existed at the time. And not only that, they then transmitted or transferred all of the information from one part to another. Now, it might seem simple, but here's a simple question. What are these tools used for? For example, the one right at the bottom, the sort of clamp thing, what is that used for? It's actually unknown today. Now, of course, a lot of these things have disappeared from the surgeon's desk, but this is after about 1,000 years. Now, having said everything I've said about these mediciners, there's something bigger going on that we need to talk about. And the reason why we need to talk about this is because some people don't understand what is meant by transfer. And I tell you why this is important. The genius of the Greeks, the genius of the Middle Eastern Golden Age of Islam era, and the genius of the Moors, the genius of so many people, the West was not having inventors within your rank. That was not the genius. The genius part was going around the world searching for the best practices to see, compare, and contrast the best ideas. And the Islamic Golden Age did this perfectly. Here, from a book which is from the 1100s that claims that it comes from Galen, that it's a rewriting of scripts from Galen, is here, and it shows the history of taking from the old and giving to the new. Ayurvedic medicine and thousands of herbs were imported from the Indians as well. They did not limit themselves to their own personal inventions, which is in fact called regression. When you close yourself off from other people, your society starts to fall apart, which happened to a lot of civilizations in history. And this is where the real genius lies. It didn't lie in the fact that they had so many other geniuses. If, in fact, if you notice, 90% of the geniuses that I show from the Islamic Golden Age, be they from Sudan, be they from India, be they from Europe, be they from the Middle East, or wherever, you'll notice that the first thing they do is give credit to the people who came before them. Even the historian Al Masudi mentions Galen, and he mentions him four times really in his book. One referring to the black Africans, where Al Masudi makes some very stereotypically racist comments about black people. Well, Galen does, not Al Masudi. Al Masudi debunks it. Uh, but here he makes another statement where he says, of his length, body, he is the most courageous, for he possesses a degree of heat which is not found in other birds. We found that his chest consists of a tendinous texture and is not swelled with flesh. The words of Arsiginas are confirmed by Galen. The former author says further that the falcon builds his nest on trees of thorns. So, as you can see there, they used Galen as an authority. Now, not every single person took Galen seriously, especially not Al Jahiz, the mischievous. Here's what he says: a diseased background and a bad example are sicknesses that neither Galen nor any other physician could treat, and deference to great men, imitation of one's ancestors, attachment to the traditional religion, and the habit of clinging to that which is familiar, all these are tendencies that call for drastic treatment, and much space could have been devoted to them. He reverts to cats and draws comparisons to cats and dogs, tells some anecdotes, attacks the opponents of spontaneous generation, and after referring to scorpions, tells the following story. Now you can see there, if you don't count the bottom paragraph, that's just telling you that he does this through narrative. Al Jahiz does a lot of his talking through narrative. He doesn't speak directly a lot of the time. So the one at the bottom, the paragraph at the bottom, is just a quote added by the other people who were translating this book. But you can see there that he does not agree necessarily with this genius idea of just believing something because ancients said it. And remember, and look what he says. He doesn't say, I don't believe in doing what ancients did because I don't believe in this one thing or this other thing. He goes straight for the chin and says, a diseased background and a bad example are sicknesses that neither Galen nor any other physician could treat. A diseased background. What this means is someone who is copying an idea that is already rotten. In other words, a bad idea, as he writes there, a bad example, is a sickness that Galen, who is considered one of the great uh, medicine men, nor any other physician could treat. Nobody. And deference to great men, imitation of one's ancestors, attachment to the traditional religion, and this is the part that's important. Think about how many people he would upset today if he was a really famous person today by saying, first of all, whoever people think is like the greatest doctor in our modern time, if he said, go screw that guy, and anybody else who has studied medicine, and then he says, for all of you people who have a hero, that's dumb. And then he says imitating one's ancestors. So even looking deep into your own history is bad. It's a disease. And attachment to traditional religion. That's the part that it gets me the most, because clearly he mentioned in the other section in the video I made before, where he said that people who are just walking down the street will argue with you about anything that is of these type of topics, but they will not go and study them for real. And you can see here he's doubling down on it by saying that people will attach themselves to religion, and the habit of clinging to that which is familiar. This sounds like something that's you would hear today from like some thinker who was born now, but this is Al Jahiz. Now make no mistake, he still gives credit to the older people. He still gives credit to the ancestors, but his thing was about people using people like Galen, who, by the way, Galen did say some racist things. People using people like Galen, using people like um, the ancient Greeks or whoever as gospel. It's like, oh, we checked and the ancient Greeks agree with us, therefore we're correct. He was against that. But if you had tested something and it turned out to be correct, you had no problem saying that the first person who ever did it was this older person. And this is what set Al Jahiz apart. This long passage I like because it shows the full scope and the full personality of Al Jahiz as he mentions the success of Zoroaster. And he says, had it happened at a time which marked the nadir of decadence, and among a people utterly devoid of sense of humor, scruples, social conscience, fastidiousness, and desire for cleanliness, he could not have done it. Some say that his success was due to the fact that he began with the king and managed to win him over by virtue of his insight into his disposition, his character, and his desires, and that it was the sovereign who then influenced the common people towards this religion. But those who put forward this line of argument are only just above the level of the common herd in their understanding of the ways of the world. For the king could not have influenced the common people towards this religion unless Zoroaster had first spread disaffection among king's troops, and the king could have had no power over the common people through the medium of the army, even had it been 10 times as large, if there had not been a minority among the common people ready to side with the army amongst the common people itself. But kings have no reason to hazard their power in such circumstances, for their only aim is expediency. They will not risk losing their throne for the sake of something non essential, except when their power is based on the imamate, and their imamate on the prophethood, for in the latter case they are committed to the obligations of divine law, which is also the path of common sense, since the legislator knows better than anyone else the secret of righteousness. It must be remembered that the period in question was an extremely decadent one, and these men, the worst of men, you never find a follower of any other religion giving it up to become a Zoroastrian, and anyway, the doctrine only spread in their country, in Fars, Media, and the Khorasan, and all that is Persian. If you are surprised at my uncomplimentary remarks about the intelligence of Corsius Parvis and his forebears, his friends and advisors, his scribes, doctors, sages, and knights, let me tell you something to show that I am not simply carried away by fanaticism. You must understand that I am not referring to those of later generations who were born into this faith, brought up in this religion, nurtured on these doctrines, and reared in these beliefs. We all know that the Greeks had minds far above belief in materialism or the cult of the planets and signs of the zodiac, and that the Indians are above believing in the obedience due to Buddha or in the cult of idols, pieces of carved wood, standing stones, or rock carvings. Now, the interesting thing about that as well is that when he talks about the Greeks, he says the Greeks were above materialism, belief in materialism, which is idol worship, or the cult of planets and signs of the zodiac. The interesting thing about that is that Al Masudi mentions certain thing about the zodiac and mentions how certain people correlate. So he says this zodiac correlates to this and that zodiac correlates to that, and to have Al Jahiz laugh at that or talk bad about that here is hilarious, and that the Indians are above the believing in the obedience due to the Buddha or in the cult of idols, pieces of carved wood, standing stones, or rock carvings. And you can see there he gives credit again to the Buddhists, saying that they are above, first of all, obedience, which that's interesting that, a man living in the Islamic world is talking against obedience based on faith. We see here also a moon god. This is in a book of medicine, but we don't need to get into that because it's going to be long. But you notice how they're not dressed particularly like Muslims. That's because this is a throwback, and I'm talking about how they were taking from other cultures. It's a throwback to the Mesopotamians. Now, going back on everything that I said and the compliments I gave to Al Jahiz, it's not like history has nothing to offer us, of course, because as you can see, the ancient Egyptians played such a big role in giving the future of medicine. And of course, they would be get passed through the Phoenicians and all these other people. I mean, Indians played a huge role historically when it comes to medicine, and there's several other groups of people, but right now I'm focusing on the Middle Easterners, and also the fact that the Middle Eastern world was actually more of a global world than it ever had been. And it's funny how, if you look at technology and you look at the speeding up of technology and the speeding up of people accepting technology and literacy and everything, something you'll notice is the time in the golden age of Islam when that happened was when they wanted to expand their world and they were sort of free, and people could write whatever they want and do whatever they want. I mean, in a sense, they have freedom of speech. I mean, everything that Al Jahiz has written is something that you probably would not be allowed to say anywhere else. Whereas after that, things start to regress and then they start to progress again because people are starting to look at things in an enlightened way. But then you start to notice that today, the reason why we're back speeding through technology is because of the multi contributions from different people from different parts of the world. Like I said, the genius of the West, the genius of the golden age of Islam, the genius of a lot of these places was not necessarily having genius inventors. The genius was realizing that there were geniuses outside of your borders. The idiots that then tried to close these borders and pretend that you should not take anything from people outside, they made it hard for these people because these people would write about the people. I mean, even this translation by even these translations happened so early. William Harvey and Da Vinci are described as the first to explain systemic circulation and pulmonary circulation in the body of the human and, of course, the body of animals. This would be interesting how late it arrived if it was completely true. But of course, we know that the way that Da Vinci discovered this was through dissection, and so did William Harvey. But people believe that William Harvey was inspired by Da Vinci. A person who was not inspired by either Da Vinci or William Harvey is an Islamic scholar that existed hundreds of years before these people, and he also mentioned these systems.
His name was Ibn al-Nafis, and he lived in 1200s and was an Arab physician. As we read, who made several important contributions to the early knowledge of the pulmonary circulation. He was the first person to challenge the long-held contention of the Galen school that blood could pass through the cardiac interventricular septum, and in keeping with this, he believed that all the blood that reached the left ventricle passed through the lung. He also stated that there must be small communications or pores between the pulmonary artery and vein, a prediction that preceded by 400 years the discovery of the pulmonary capillaries by Marcello Malpighi. Ibn al-Nafis and another eminent physiologist of the period of Avicenna belonged to the long period between the enormously influential school of Galen in the 2nd century and the European scientist Renaissance in the 16th century. This is an epoch often given little attention by physiologists, but is known to some historians as the Islamic Golden Age. Its importance is briefly discussed here. Now, it cannot be stated in a harsher way, because I don't want to just be like bashing the Europeans. So it cannot be stated harsher that the drawings, there's no contest. Da Vinci smoked everybody in the Arab world when it came to art. There's not even one person who compares. But going back to this physician and why he was even better than Ibn Sina in this context. And remember, there's a reason why I showed you Al-Jahiz, and that's because I wanted to show you that a combination of both accepting the old, as they did with Galen, and rejecting the old, as Al-Jahiz recommends, if his answer is rotten, made this person predict things about the heart and its circulation and how things and blood circulate through the body hundreds of years before anybody else. This is the power of that idea. That's why I said the idea is more powerful than the individuals. And we read, at the time of Ibn al-Nafas, the teachings of Galen and his school had held sway for 1,000 years. Avicenna studied Galen's writings extensively and embellished them to some extent. In Galen's scheme, food in the gut underwent concoction and was transported to the liver, where the blood was formed and imbued with natural spirit. The blood then flowed to the right ventricle, where some entered the lungs via the pulmonary artery to nourish them. But the remainder of the blood reached the left ventricle through invisible pores in the interventricular septum. The existence of these so-called pores was a puzzle for anatomists for over 1,000 years, but they were a necessary feature of Galen's scheme because it was not appreciated that a large amount of blood flowed from the lungs to the heart. In the left ventricle, the blood was mixed with pneuma from the air that was inhaled, and that result was the formation of vital spirit, which was distributed throughout the body by arterial blood. Some reached the brain, where it received animal spirit, which was then distributed via the nerves, which were thought to be hollow. The formation of vital spirit in the left ventricle led to a generation of fuliginous waste products that traveled back to the lung through the pulmonary vein and then were exhaled with the breath.
That model had its uses, but it was not complete. Challenging Galen for the first time in 1,000 years, Ibn Nafis said, and we read here, first he stated categorically that the intraventricular septum between the right and the left ventricle was not porous and could not allow blood to travel through it, as was critical in Galen's model. Here is the English translation made by Meroff in the book of Ibn Nafis, identified as Fall 46, but there is no passage between these two cavities. For the substance of the heart is solid in this region, and has neither a visible passage, as was thought by some persons, nor an invisible one, which could have permitted the transmission of blood, as was alleged by Galen. The pores of the heart there are closed, and its substance is thick. This forceful denial of the permeability of the intraventricular septum is also repeated elsewhere in the commentary, for example, in the section identified as Fall 65. Meroff's translation is as follows: there is no passage at all between these two ventricles. If there were, the blood would penetrate to the place of the spirit, the left ventricle, and spoil its substance. Anatomy refutes the contentions. On the contrary, the septum between the two ventricles is of thicker substance than any other part to prevent the passage of blood or spirit which might be harmful. Therefore, the contention of some persons to say that this place is porous is erroneous. It is based on the preconceived idea that blood from the right ventricle had to pass through this porosity, and they are wrong. Calling Galen wrong, who used to be, as you saw in the previous one, just seen as the authority. Second, since there is no communication between the right and left ventricle through the interventricular septum, it follows that the output of the right ventricle can only reach the left ventricle via a pulmonary circulation. In the section of the commentary identified as Fall 46, Mayweather translates read, the blood after it has been refined in his cavity must be transmitted to the left cavity where the spirit is generated. In the section identified as Fall 65, the translation reads, for the blood penetration of the blood into the left ventricle is from the lung after it has been heated within the right ventricle and risen from it, as we stand before. Third, in a further short passage, Ibn al-Nafis states that there must be small communication between the pulmonary artery and the pulmonary vein. This was an inspired prediction of the existence of the pulmonary capillaries because these were not seen until 400 years later by Marcello Malpighi. Here is the translation of the relevant section. And for the same reason, there exists perceptible passages or pores between the two blood vessels, namely pulmonary artery and pulmonary vein, reproduces part of the commentary relating to the pulmonary circulation in the original Arabic texts. And just like that, the work of two masters is made into geniusness. Galen and his old way of thinking, and the Arabs and their new way of thinking. Suddenly, it became fashionable to discredit old people who had bad ideas. And who was the first to state this? Al-Jahiz. Al-Jahiz did not want to look upon the world and think of it as a world full of the correct and the incorrect. He did not believe that experts knew more than the foolish. But he also didn't want fools to argue with him in the middle of the street. His skeptical nature paid off for him in several ways, and it paid off for other scholars in the Islamic world, like when we start talking about astronomy and stuff like that. But here, if we look at Al-Nafis, we can see that he predates all of these Europeans, and he did it without drawings, at least not detailed drawings like the ones of Da Vinci. And this is because a lot of the stuff that a lot of the genius of the Islamic world was being able to put writing behind any type of drawing or mathematical system. This is where we start to get the algorithms made by one of the Islamic scholars, which we'll talk about in another time. The words of Al-Nafis would outlive him, but it was only about 80 years ago that Al-Nafis's work was seen for its great contributions. And here's what they say about the Europeans. It was not until 300 years later that the scholars in Europe came to the same conclusion independently, that is, that the blood had to pass through the pulmonary circulation and could not move directly from right to left ventricle. The first person to state this was Michael Servetus, who wrote, however, this communication is made not through the middle wall of the heart, as is commonly believed, but by a very ingenious arrangement. The refined blood is urged forward from the right ventricle of the heart over a long course through the lungs. It is treated by the lungs because reddish yellow is poured from the pulmonary artery into the pulmonary vein. Well, I promised that I would talk about the Book of Animals, and in the Book of Animals, Al-Jahiz talks about how he saw a snake bite a camel, a camel that was breastfeeding. And while the camel was breastfeeding, the child of the camel collapsed. And then he said there's some kind of transfer from the venom to death. While I can't confirm whether or not that could happen, it's still an interesting story that he says he saw with his own eyes. This, you remember I talked about the art of the Islamic world. This is somewhat what you would call the art of the Islamic world by Jahiz, the Book of Animals. And you can see that it's about the same level as the ancient Egyptians. This is Averroes, another polymath who also focused on medicine, but we don't need to get into more medical information. It's very tiresome, which adds to how dedicated these people were. If you think about how tired you might be just listening to it, they were living it every day. To finish off, I'll finish with this. We climbed higher thanks to these people. We've seen further because of their work with lenses. We are less sick today, not because of something we did, but something they did that we continued. We are a product of these great men. And because we are that, we should appreciate every single one of them and not allow politics, race, or any other kind of division to disallow us to love the information that has been brought forth. There's a couple of subjects within science that I need to cover in the Islamic world, but later I need to cover the ancient Egyptians and how they created their boats, because I realized I've never done that in great detail, which is why I was having a hard time debunking that other guy who was saying that the ancient Egyptians never built seafaring boats.